Module 16, The Debates and the Future. We've reached the end of the road together, and it's the right moment to stop describing the system and start questioning it. Because here's an uncomfortable fact you've probably already sensed. After decades of pledges, funds, mechanisms, and summits, the money reaching the developing world for climate is still a fraction of what's needed. It often arrives as debt to countries already drowning in debt, and the poorest, most vulnerable places still find it hardest to access. So in this final module, we won't add new machinery. We'll ask the honest questions that serious people in this field are arguing about right now, and we'll end by talking about you, what to watch, and why your work matters. By the end of this module, you'll understand the core debates over whether climate finance is additional, effective, and fairly structured. The live movement to reform the international financial system, from Bridgetown to the reshaping of the development banks, and what a practitioner in a developing country should keep their eye on in the years ahead. Let's start with a deceptively simple word that causes enormous argument: additionality. When rich countries report the climate finance they've provided, is that money new, additional money on top of the aid they were already giving? Or have they simply taken existing development aid, the money that used to build schools and clinics, relabeled it as climate finance, and reported the same dollar twice? This is not a small accounting quibble. If a country's climate finance is really just its old aid budget wearing a new coat, then the developing world has been promised transformation and handed a relabeling exercise. Study after study has found that a large share of reported climate finance is diverted or relabeled rather than genuinely new. And this is why the trust deficit, the one that runs all the way back to the broken $100 billion promise you learned about early in this course, remains so raw. When developing country negotiators demand that climate finance be new and additional, this is the fear they're guarding against. The second great debate is about effectiveness. Set aside how much money there is and ask, does the money that does flow actually work? Does it reach the ground, or does a large share evaporate in consultants, overheads, and the machinery of the intermediaries? Does it build lasting local capacity or create dependency? Does it fund what communities actually need, or what's fashionable in donor capitals? You've seen across this course how many hands a dollar can pass through, from a fund to an international entity to a national body to a contractor, before it ever touches a farmer's field. Every hand is, in principle, adding value and accountability. But every hand also takes time and takes a cut, and the honest question is how much genuine climate benefit survives the journey. Effectiveness is about the quality of the money, not just the quantity, and it's a debate where your on-the-ground perspective is worth more than any spreadsheet. Which leads directly to the third and perhaps most consequential debate for a country like yours: grants versus debt. Recall the spectrum of money from early in the course, from grants, which never have to be repaid, through concessional loans, which are cheaper than market loans, to full commercial debt. Here is the problem. A great deal of what's counted as climate finance is loans, not grants, and many of the countries on the front line of climate change are already heavily indebted. So we arrive at something close to absurd. A country contributes almost nothing to the problem, gets hammered by climate impacts it didn't cause, and is then offered loans, more debt, to cope with a crisis imposed on it from outside. The country pays interest to adapt to a catastrophe it didn't create. For adaptation especially, which as you know rarely generates the revenue to repay a loan, many argue that grants are the only just instrument, and that piling debt onto climate-vulnerable nations is both unfair and self-defeating, because a country buried in debt can't invest in resilience anyway. If grants are so clearly fairer, especially for adaptation, why does so much climate finance still come as loans? Is it just stinginess? Partly it's that grant money is genuinely scarce. Grants come straight from taxpayers, and every finance minister in a donor country fights over that budget, whereas loans can be issued at far greater scale because the money is expected to come back. A dollar of grant is a dollar spent. A dollar lent can be recycled. So loans let donors report big headline numbers cheaply, which is exactly why the headline numbers are so often loans. But it's also a genuine dilemma, not pure stinginess. If you insisted every dollar be a grant, the total volume would collapse because the world isn't willing to gift trillions. The reformers' answer isn't grants only. It's to match the instrument to the purpose. Grants for adaptation and for the poorest and most debt-stressed countries, where loans do real harm, and loans, guarantees, and leverage for revenue-generating mitigation projects that can genuinely pay their way. The failure isn't that loans exist. It's that loans get pushed onto adaptation and onto countries that can't bear more debt, because that's the cheap and easy path for the lender. That grants versus debt problem opens straight into the biggest idea in this final module: the movement to reform the entire international financial architecture. That grand phrase just means the underlying plumbing of global money, the development banks, the monetary institutions, the credit trading agencies, the rules that decide who can borrow, how much, and at what price. The argument gaining real force is that this plumbing was designed for a different era and is structurally rigged against developing countries, and that tinkering at the edges with a bit more fund money will never be enough. You have to reform the pipes themselves. The banner for this movement is the Bridgetown Initiative, named for the capital of Barbados and driven by its Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, whose plain-spoken demands for justice have made her one of the most powerful voices in this whole field. Bridgetown is a package of proposals to rewire global finance in favor of vulnerable countries. Let me give you its spirit through its key demands. It calls for cheaper, longer-term lending so that poorer countries aren't crushed by high interest rates and short repayment windows. It calls for far more lending capacity from the development banks. It calls for meaningful debt relief. And it calls for something wonderfully practical: pause clauses. A pause clause is a provision written into a loan that automatically suspends repayments when a disaster strikes, a hurricane, a catastrophic flood, so that a country hit by a climate catastrophe isn't also forced to keep servicing its debt in the very month its economy has been flattened. When you hear Bridgetown, think, reform the whole system so it stops punishing the vulnerable for a crisis they didn't cause. Sitting alongside Bridgetown is a more technical but hugely important reform aimed squarely at the multilateral development banks, the World Bank, the ADB, and their peers you met earlier in the course. It goes by the name Capital Adequacy Reform, and the core idea is genuinely elegant once you see it. These banks sit on large amounts of capital, money from their member governments, and they've traditionally been extremely cautious, lending only a conservative multiple of that capital in order to protect their pristine credit ratings and their ability to borrow cheaply. Critics, backed by a major review commissioned by the group of 20 leading economies, argued that the banks were being needlessly timid, that they could safely lend substantially more against the same capital without losing their top-tier ratings. Squeeze more lending out of the money that's already sitting there. That's the capital adequacy review in a sentence. Change the internal rules so the development banks lend hundreds of billions more from the balance sheets they already have. It's one of the highest leverage reforms on the table precisely because it needs no new money from anyone, just more courage from the banks. There's another lever in this reform toolkit worth naming, because it made real news and it shows how creative the thinking has become: special drawing rights. These are a kind of reserve asset created by the International Monetary Fund. Think of them, loosely, as an international currency that governments hold. When the IMF issued a large batch of them during the pandemic, most flowed automatically to rich countries that didn't really need them, simply because of how the rules allocate them. Reformers asked an obvious question: why not channel those unused special drawing rights from wealthy countries who are sitting on them idle toward the development banks and vulnerable countries who could put them to work on climate and resilience? Efforts to rechannel these reserves are underway, and while the sums and the mechanics get technical, the principle is the same one running through all of this. The money largely exists somewhere in the global system. The fight is about redirecting it to where it's needed. You don't need the details. You need to recognize the pattern. You should also know that the credit trading agencies we met in the bond module sit right at the center of this fairness debate. Because those agencies grade developing countries as riskier, those countries pay more to borrow, and critics argue the ratings can be too pessimistic, too slow to recognize progress, and even that they penalize countries for investing in long-term climate resilience. When a rating pushes up a vulnerable country's borrowing costs, it directly shrinks what that country can spend on adaptation. So reform of how sovereign risk gets judged, making it fairer, more transparent, more attuned to climate realities, is quietly one of the most consequential frontiers of all, even though it rarely makes headlines. Now let me use these reforms to revisit a slogan you met early in the course and hold it up to honest light. Billions to trillions. The idea, you'll recall, was that scarce public money should be used to leverage, to attract, to crowd in far larger sums of private capital, turning billions of public dollars into trillions of total investment. It remains the official theory of the whole system, and in some sectors it genuinely works. But you should now be able to hear its hollow ring in others. For much of the developing world, the private trillions never showed up. The private sector went where returns were safe and high, mature mitigation projects in stabler economies, and stayed away from adaptation, from the poorest countries, from exactly the places the money was most needed. So the honest verdict on billions to trillions is neither that it's a lie nor that it's a triumph. It's that leverage is a powerful tool that works beautifully in the places that need it least and fails in the places that need it most. And mistaking the slogan for a strategy has let public actors off the hook for the direct, grant-based funding that only they can provide. This is a lot of grand, global reform, banks, summits, financial architecture. What can any of it possibly have to do with me, sitting in a national ministry or a project office? Isn't this above my level? It's exactly at your level in two ways. First, these reforms are not abstract. They change the actual terms of the money that reaches your desk. Whether a development bank can lend your country more, whether your loan has a pause clause for the next flood, whether finance comes as a grant or a debt, those are decided in the debates we've just described, and they determine what you can offer the communities you serve. Second, and more importantly, this system changes in response to pressure and to evidence, and evidence comes from practitioners like you. Every well-documented project that proves adaptation works, every honest account of a proposal that failed because the barriers were too high, every clear-eyed report of debt doing harm, that's the raw material reformers use to make their case. You are not a bystander to this system. You are one of the people whose experience, aggregated with thousands of others, actually bends it. Before we close, let me name the practical thing to watch, the one that ties this whole module to your daily work: fragmentation and the access burden. You've now met, across this course, an almost comical number of separate funds, banks, agencies, and mechanisms, each with its own application form, its own accreditation, its own reporting rules, its own jargon. For a well-staffed, rich country, that's an inconvenience. For a small climate ministry in a least developed country, it's a wall. The sheer administrative burden of accessing this fragmented system consumes the scarce capacity of exactly the countries least able to spare it. So watch for every move toward simplification, harmonization, and streamlined access. Common standards across funds, simplified procedures for small and vulnerable states, pooled national funds that reduce the number of doors you have to knock on. Fragmentation is the quiet tax on the poor in this system, and reducing it may do more good, more quickly, than any single new pledge. So, to bring it together, and to bring the whole course together, the debates that will define climate finance in your working life are whether the money is truly additional or merely relabeled aid, whether it's effective once it survives the journey to the ground, and whether it comes as fair grants or as unjust debt piled onto the vulnerable. The Great Reform Movement, Bridgetown's demand to rewire global finance, the capital adequacy push to make the development banks lend far more from the capital they already hold, and a clear-eyed reckoning with the limits of billions to trillions, is the live attempt to fix the plumbing rather than just top up the tank. And the barrier you'll feel most personally is fragmentation, the access burden that falls hardest on those with the least capacity to bear it. And now, the close. You began this course, perhaps, feeling that finance was a foreign language, a wall of jargon standing between your climate expertise and the resources your work needs. I hope that wall is lower now, maybe gone, because here is the truth I want to leave you with. This entire vast apparatus, the funds and the bonds, the ITMOs and the guarantees, the accreditation forms and the reform summits, exists for one purpose: to move resources to people and places on the front line of a crisis they did not create. That is a profoundly human mission, dressed in the language of finance. And the people who can speak both languages, who understand the science and the suffering and also understand the money and the machinery, those people are rare, and they are exactly the ones who make this system actually deliver. You are now one of them. The finance is not the point, it's the tool. You already knew what the world is for. Now you know how to fund it. Go and put the money where it's needed. That's the whole job, and it's a good one. Thank you for listening, and good luck.